Robert goes to see Lyanna right away. As soon as he arrives at Winterfell after a very long journey, it's first on his list, apart from perhaps basic hellos. He still pines for her, perhaps as much as he still hates the man he killed for stealing him away from her. Or so he says. He believes what he says, but is that really what happened? Ned, his best friend, does not corroborate this in his own thoughts. He corroborates the anger and the love, but not the stealing away part. In fact, Ned doesn't really have negative thoughts about Rhaegar at all. Given that Robert claims Rhaegar kidnapped and raped Lyanna, this is telling, to say the least. What exactly it tells us is where it gets tricky, however. Later in the book, we learn about the Tower of Joy, where Lyanna and Rhaegar went sometime after this kidnapping/elopement, where she died just as Ned found her. We learn also of the tourney of Harrenhal, the event that set up Rhaegar and Lyanna's meeting, where the Knight of the Laughing Tree made their appearance, and where Rhaegar named Lyanna Queen of Love and Beauty, laying the blue rose laurel in her lap in front of his own wife and everybody else, like her betrothed Robert. Like Illyrio said, however, to crown her is to kill her. In this case, crowning her as the Queen of Love and Beauty. Forever after, Lyanna is associated with that blue rose garland, and it in turn is associated with her doom. What started at the tourney ended at the Tower of Joy, and this kidnapping/elopement of Lyanna and Rhaegar is in between. Their disappearance is that mysterious bridge between these two other huge, equally mysterious, seminal A Song of Ice and Fire mysteries. Along the way, we learn how these events are associated with the princess/prince that was promised, the Song of Ice and Fire, lots of other prophetic things, and this was one of the key sparks that lit the flame of Robert's rebellion in the first place. The very downfall of House Targaryen can be pinned on this moment. By simply removing the encounter of Lyanna and Rhaegar, the abduction or whatever you want to call it, everything changes. Aerys may still have lost the crown, but there may not have been civil war. He may have lost it to his own son rather than to Robert. There probably wouldn't have been a civil war at all. Of course, this is not a what-if episode. We're not trying to figure out what would have happened instead. Nevertheless, it goes to show the importance of Lyanna and Rhaegar's relationship, made all the more intriguing by the knowledge that they surely had some idea of the political turmoil they would be causing. That said, they couldn't have foreseen Aerys burning Rickard and strangling Brandon, nor the civil war that followed. But she was betrothed, and he was married with children, so they had to know it would cause problems, regardless of their reasoning or what have you. Truly, it's a great story, even without all the other huge ramifications and surrounding mysteries. For example, we're not going to attempt to solve what Rhaegar believed about the prophecy or really what happened at the Tower of Joy. Those are highly relevant things, but we're really just focused on this encounter, what happened just before, what set it up, what it led to. We have many questions. And we have all that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome back to another episode. It is approximately 3 o'clock here in Atlanta, Georgia. And this is when we stream on Sundays, when we do stream, which is most Sundays, 3 o'clock Eastern on YouTube. Afterwards, you can catch the video still on YouTube, or if you wait a little while, you can catch an edited version on Spotify, or the audio-only version anywhere you catch podcasts. And that will be ad-free if you check it out on Patreon. This episode was chosen by patrons during the Topics Moot 2024. I believe I misspoke calling a previous episode the 7th episode of Topics Moot. It was the 8th. This is the 9th. We've got 3 more after this. We're finishing the year strong with Topics Moot topics. Oh, wait, did I count wrong again? Maybe this is the 10th. I don't know. We're going to finish before the end of the year. Anyway, I'm better at writing the episodes than counting the numbers. That's for sure. Also, big thanks to Nina, goodqueenally.tumblr.com. Of course, that's one L in Alley. She provided a huge amount of great notes for this one, even more than usual. She's always extremely helpful, but she particularly loves this topic, has given it a lot of thought. got me started in a lot of places I hadn't considered, and I built on that a bit. And yeah, just very thankful for that. Her latest post on goodqueenally.tumblr.com is a question about Sarah Targaryen and whether or not she owned slaves. Interesting. If you have questions for us, certainly drop them here in the live stream if you're watching, or send them to westeroshistory@gmail.com, or catch us on any social media site. We're pretty much everywhere. Trivia question. Let's start with that. Robert and Lyanna was a ship that never sailed, but Robert did name a ship after her. What did he call this so-called beautiful war galley? Yeah, it's a beautiful war galley. That's actually what he named the ship. That's not usually what you call war galleys. Beautiful. No. But backing up just a second, Ashea wants me to remind you all that we're now in blue sky. We have migrated over there like the first men from Essos to Westeros across the land
bridge. We've been there
bridge.
for a while, but we're using blue sky now.
That's true.
History of Westeros is at historyofwesteros.com. We're just our website. I'm Ashea at historyofwesteros.com. If Aziz or Sean make a personal account, they will be Dancing Sean at History of Westeros and Aziz at History of Westeros.
That's
so
right.
I hope to see you there.
Yeah, hope to see you there. The skies are very blue. So let's go through real quick what the different sections in this episode are, do a little setup, and then dive right in. We're going to start with key questions. Then why not an abduction? A question of marriage. Where and how? The fallout. And then, assuming we have time, we've got a whole bunch of Lyanna parallels, especially Sansa and Arya, but quite a few others after that. So let's do that. Let's make our way through all of that and have some fun. We'll start with the episode, as we often do when dealing with mysteries, which is we'll lay out what we know, the most solid information, and then gradually move towards the things we know less, the things we're guessing or theorizing or imagining, filling in the blanks with possibilities, all that. So we'll start with A Clash of Kings, Dany 4, that most famous of scenes, the visions in the House of the Undying, where we actually get dialogue from Rhaegar himself, and we even see Princess Elia and their young son, Prince Aegon. Quote,
"Will you make a song for him?" the woman asked.
"He has a song,"
the man replied.
"He is the prince that was promised, and his is the song of ice and fire."
He looked up when he said it, and his eyes met Dany's, and it seemed as if he saw her standing there beyond the door.
"There must be one more,"
he said, though whether he was speaking to her or the woman in the bed, she could not say.
"The dragon has 3 heads."
He went to the window seat, picked up a harp, and ran his fingers lightly over its silvery strings.
Yeah, Lyanna and Rhaegar isn't just a mystery to the readers, it's a mystery in world. It's a double whammy that way. Dany doesn't have much personal information on her brother. She never met him. And Viserys was really young, so didn't really know him very well either, so she couldn't get that much from him. The opportunity is, or maybe the opportunity has already been lost for her to learn from Barristan. We'll see. But that is somebody who's a POV that has some information on Rhaegar and a little bit on Lyanna. Same goes for another Kingsguard knight, Sir Jaime Lannister, who missed the majority of the tourney of Harrenhal, but knew Rhaegar and Aerys. Tywin tried to marry Cersei to Rhaegar, so there's that, and instead Cersei married Robert, who whispered Lyanna in her ear on their wedding night. Yeah, that worked out great for her. For both of them, really. If you aren't looking closely, you might not realize how deeply her death impacted so many characters. The sheer number of POV characters that mention her or that reference her is, well, I didn't go quite so far as to actually count that, but it's a lot. And the count's probably going to grow. I'm sure we're going to see more mentions of her in the future. Even Kevin Lannister in his solo chapter briefly thinks of Lyanna. Like, yeah, even him. He may not have known much about her, and he's dead anyway, so we won't be getting more from him. But it's still noteworthy. And Maester Aemon. He may have corresponded with Rhaegar on a number of matters of family and prophecy and such, but unless he wrote some stuff down that is going to be figured out later or discovered, and Sam isn't there to do that, that's probably another literal dead end in terms of future information. Ned couldn't have learned all the details, given how little he had with Lyanna when he found her. They didn't exactly have time to talk about it. She was on her deathbed already, apparently. Or if he somehow did, well, he's dead too. We can't get any more information out of him either, most likely. So we shall learn no more from a lot of these characters that have given us some info. Though, I should say that when all is said and done, or even when we get another book, some of Ned's chapters might look different in retrospect given new information about Lyanna. Certain callbacks or Easter eggs we might not have ever caught might be found. George is awfully good at that. Catelyn has information for us as well, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, if you've been paying close attention. It's not from things Ned told her, because Ned, he hasn't said much about not just Jon Snow, but about Lyanna and about Brandon. He didn't even really tell his kids the truth about what happened to Brandon and his father. He gave them the PG version, basically. But we get so Catelyn didn't learn a lot from Ned on that, but the Tullys weren't at the tourney of Harrenhal, so she didn't learn anything there. But she was about to marry Brandon until Brandon diverted his plans to get married to her to go deal with the abduction of his sister. It was a few days from happening. Catelyn was betrothed for 6 years to Brandon, and then just right before, like days before they were going to get married, nope. So, and then of course she married Ned instead. So it was a family matter, but a royal family matter, and with these several great houses mixed in, which means it's a matter of history as well. It's very personal, but it's also part of the public record because the doings of kings and high lords and all their families is, of course, a big part of history, especially when it leads to civil war. So before we get too deeper in the personal elements, let's balance this out a bit with how the mystery looks to those in-world who don't have those connections. Quote,
"As cold winds hammered the city, King Aerys II turned to his pyromancers, charging them to drive the winter off with their magics. Huge green fires burned along the walls of the Red Keep for a moon's turn. Prince Rhaegar was not in the city to observe them, however, nor could he be found in Dragonstone with Princess Elia and their young son Aegon. With the coming of the new year, the Crown Prince had taken to the road with 6 of his closest friends and confidants on a journey that would ultimately lead him back to the Riverlands. Not 10 leagues from Harrenhal, where Rhaegar would, once again, come face to face with Lyanna Stark of Winterfell, and with her light a fire that would consume his house and kin and all those he loved, and half the realm besides. But that tale is too well known to warrant repeating here."
Too well known? Every single one of us would have wanted that to be repeated there, Yandel. Darn you. But there's actually a twist here. It's so known that it's been changed. What we just read to you was the original text in The World of Ice and Fire, but this is actually what it says now. This is what most of you have seen.
"Not 10 leagues from Harrenhal, Rhaegar fell upon Lyanna Stark of Winterfell and carried her off, lighting a fire that would consume his house and kin and all those he loved, and half the realm besides."
So to clarify there, the difference is where Rhaegar would once come again face to face with Lyanna Stark of Winterfell versus fell upon Lyanna Stark of Winterfell and carried her off. Those are very different, right? So the change made there makes it much more clearly an abduction in the record. Obviously, the truth is not necessarily what was written there, but that makes sense. Remember, who was The World of Ice and Fire written for? Robert. So it's definitely going to want to reflect Robert's beliefs here. It's not going to say, yeah, we're not sure what happened here. No, Robert would be mad about that. He would want it clarified. So this makes a lot of sense. Even though Robert died before the book was given to him, it still would have been conceived that way. And it makes sense for story purposes to have that be the party line, the common belief. And this is how Dany thinks of it, right? This is how she perceives it. When Barristan brings up the tourney of Harrenhal, Dany not only notes that Rhaegar crowned Lyanna Queen of Love and Beauty, but says Rhaegar stole her away from her betrothed. So even Dany thinks that. Now, of course, again, she didn't know her brother, so this isn't like some opinion she formed on her own. It's what she's been told. So referring back to the original part of the quote there, too, there's winter and the fire of the pyromancer. She got a little ice and fire going there. This is all following the false spring. This is a really important point. It's easy to lose sight of why this matters. Because consider the prophecy. Now, we don't know the ins and outs of what Rhaegar actually believed, but we do know he believed in the prophecy. We can definitely say that much for sure. And so put yourself in his position here. He is pretty sure he can't have another child with his wife. He meets Lyanna. Then he goes back to King's Landing after the tournament, and the weather changes really quickly, dramatically quickly. It was expected to be a spring, but instead it becomes winter. He's already seen the comet. He's already seen other signs. So it really looks like more and more signs are actually happening. More and more signs of the prophecy that he's been kind of waiting his whole life for, and the urgency of it. Because, the cold winds are blowing. I thought I had more time, right? I thought this was going to play out more. He hasn't even had that third child yet. He, as we saw in that opening quote, he told his wife that third child, the third head of the dragon, was extremely important. So Nina coins a term here that I absolutely love, a sense of augural immediacy, just showing how the timeline on this prophecy was not what Rhaegar thought it was. Of course, it's still not what he thought it was by the end, but if you put ourselves in his shoes, he would have thought, okay, it's coming. Oh no, now it's coming sooner than I thought. This horrible winter, this is a really bad sudden winter. This is it. It's happening. So he needed to act quickly or he'd miss his chance to save the world. And that's really important. So in other words, to put that more succinctly, the dramatic shift in weather caused in turn a huge shift in how Rhaegar perceived the timeline of the prophecy unfolding. So when the tourney was actually happening, Rhaegar probably didn't think it was imminent. He probably thought it was close, maybe 10 years, maybe 5 years, not a month or two away. Especially because he didn't even have a third child yet, and that was crucial to him. Maybe even at that point during the tournament, he might not have yet given up on the idea of having a child with a third child with Elia. It may not have yet been clear that she couldn't do that. It's not clear when that idea was put aside. Like, yeah, no, she just can't handle a third child. She can't go through a third pregnancy. It might not have happened right away, is my point. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there in the timeline. And I don't know why he thought it would be Lyanna, like why her in particular, but that's something we'll talk about as well. Now, he already believed his second child, the son, was the son of A Song of Ice and Fire. So he doesn't think that about the third child, he even though that turned out to be Jon. So even though the Jon checks the boxes way better, it's not what Rhaegar thought was happening. He thought he was adding the third head of the dragon to support his son Aegon, not the one who would actually be the one. And just how the signs of the prophecy were there, so were the signs of spring, which is why it's called the fall spring and why it just was very surprising to everyone, even the maesters and all that. So it did have sort of a supernatural feel to it, perhaps, that the winter came so suddenly, which would have just pushed Rhaegar even more so. Another mystery for another day, but highly associated, is why Rhaegar chose Lyanna, of course, specifically. Like, what was her? Is it just because they fell for each other? Is there more to it than that? That's a mystery we can't really get at without more information, I don't think. But it's something worth pointing out. Again, the fact that he already had the child that he thought was the prince that was promised implies that he didn't think her northern blood was necessarily important. But maybe. Anyway. But the answer might be, twist here, some of you all may have considered this, some of you maybe not, that she chose him, not the other way around. Or it can be both. They both chose each other because they both had reasons to do this. It wasn't just one following the other's lead. It was they both had reasons to do this, as we'll see moving through this episode. But here's how history seemingly views the rest of what we've just discussed. The end of all this story, where the end point of their abduction/disappearance, where it leads. Quote,
"What followed Prince Rhaegar's infamous abduction of Lyanna Stark was the ruin of House Targaryen. The full depth of King Aerys' madness was subsequently revealed in his depraved actions against Lord Stark, his heir, and their supporters after they demanded redress for Rhaegar's wrongs. Instead of granting them fair hearing, King Aerys had them brutally slain, then followed these murders by demanding that Lord Jon Arryn execute his former wards, Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark. Many now agree that the true start of Robert's rebellion began with Lord Arryn's refusal and his courageous calling of his banners in the defense of justice."
Absolutely. That is true. That is how most of the fandom and in-world believes the start of Robert's Rebellion with Lord Jon's refusal. But of course, Lord Jon's refusal would not have been needed if this disappearance hadn't happened. Lyanna's disappearance, for whatever actual reasons, again, what they perceive to be the reason is what they act on. Not the actual truth. They weren't privy to. So they saw it as a kidnapping. They saw it as an abduction. And of course, these so-called depraved actions. And to be fair, they're not entirely wrong about that. Even if Lyanna wanted to go with him, it still looks really bad. More on that in a minute. And again, Ned is a better source on this matter, and he doesn't think it was a kidnapping. And most people in the fandom don't see it as an abduction. It seems like in world that's the party line. Most people see it that way, but fans of the books see it the opposite. And I think we're probably right about that. So just as we paired the last World of Ice and Fire quote with Dany's POV, let's do that again with Jaime and Catelyn in her POV for some more detail and to show how it's not just a story about Rhaegar and Lyanna. We got a lot of important characters affected about this, like I said, so let's take a look at that. Quote.
He was on his way to Riverrun when... Strange, how telling it still made her throat grow tight after all these years. When he heard about Lyanna and went to King's Landing instead, it was a rash thing to do. She remembered how her own father had raged when the news had been brought to Riverrun. The gallant fool was what he called Brandon. Jaime poured the last half cup of wine.
He rode into the Red Keep with a few companions, shouting for Prince Rhaegar to come out and die. But Rhaegar wasn't there. Aerys sent his guards to arrest them for plotting his son's murder. Among all the things Catelyn and Jaime have to talk about down in Riverrun's dungeon, George makes sure to include this. They both have their part to play in filling out the margins of this mystery, and it affects them both. It's done so smoothly. This is all very wrapped up in Jaime's issues with knighthood and politics and oaths. This is one of the things Aerys did that made him question his oaths. He witnessed these executions, let's not forget. He finally snapped a little later when... Well, he snapped his oath. He broke his oath finally when blowing up King's Landing was in the offing. You know, these other minor things by comparison, because yeah, blowing up King's Landing is a lot worse than those executions, as bad as they were. But those were the building blocks to Jaime changing his mind about his oath and turning on Aerys, because, I mean, why let him do that, you know? But it wasn't like that was the first awful thing he saw Aerys do. And for Catelyn, again, 6 years of betrothal to Brandon just for it to not happen, to die like that. I mean, so long. This is her youth. Her whole half of her youth, roughly, you know, of what she could remember from her youth would have been spent picturing herself marrying this Brandon guy. Then just at the last second, Ned subbed in instead, and we recall from her inner thoughts, she wasn't too pleased about that. You know, Brandon was a lot more attractive and handsome and manly, and Ned was quiet, and she grew to love him, as we well know. But at first it's like, disappointing. So it's personal to so many characters. And I didn't even, you know, I could re-mention Cersei here, the mention, you know, getting Lyanna whispered in her ear. That's very personal, obviously. And from Jaime as well, we learn that Rhaegar had been thinking about perhaps removing his father peaceably. Right? Like getting him to step down because of his madness. But he wasn't in a rush to do that. Maybe because he didn't have that third child yet. Maybe that was a step he wanted to take first. Maybe he was waiting for more signs of the prophecy. Maybe he was waiting for his father to just go a little bit farther into madness, which would make it easier to remove him. He could make his case a lot better if Aerys just clearly wasn't getting better and was clearly getting worse. It might win more people to his side to make his father retire early. But then things became rushed, as we discussed a minute ago. Winter happens quickly, and his priorities shift. What he thought he had time for now becomes urgent, and his priority, instead of removing his father, becomes this third child, and Lyanna. And to be fair, while Rhaegar could have expected problems for his actions and should have expected problems for his actions, should he have expected this much? Should he really have expected his father to go this far? I don't think so, but Rhaegar probably knew his father better than we did, or better than we do, rather, right? So maybe he was naive to not see it coming. Maybe not. Maybe it was a calculated risk. I mean, he's balancing the fate of all of Westeros here with this decision. And he's wrong about that, but he's sincere in believing that. He's not doing it for self-serving reasons. He genuinely seemed to believe that was happening. So I think Nina agrees here. She says, yeah, the political impact is a big deal, but he's just way more focused on the Prince That Was Promised stuff, something that he's believed since he was very young. Remember the "it seems I must be a warrior" line? That came when he was like barely older than a toddler. I mean, well, maybe a bit older than that, but not even 10 years old. I mean, we're talking like 7 or something, like Bran's age. So if he believed that he or his son was an apocalyptic hero prophesied for thousands of years, then you can see why just his father's madness isn't that important. Because to that point, his father's madness hadn't been so bad. It was kind of bad. Maybe arguably it was that bad, but he hadn't done anything quite close to what he did to Rickard and Brandon. So, he didn't care as much about the scandal he was creating when he crowned Lyanna. He clearly had bravery about his convictions here. He was clearly willing to suffer political harm, suffer political consequences for what he believed was important. Like that was already demonstrated at the Tournament of Harrenhal. So Nina says, I don't think really Rhaegar concerned himself with the reaction of Lyanna's family or the larger political world overall. Perhaps that was too much of a blind spot for him. Maybe he should have somewhat considered it. Certainly it's easy to say that in retrospect. Now, later on, of course, we're going to wonder about who can tell us more about these things. Now, the obvious answer to a lot of this is Bran. With the supernatural means, he can see through the trees. And obviously on the show, they replayed the Tower of Joy for us that way. And there's a lot of potential in the books for Bran to see into the past and give us a lot more info on some of these things. That's up to George on what he's actually feels like showing us, though, and what he thinks is relevant and what he might want to still leave in the shroud of mystery. But we also have to strongly consider Howland Reed. Howland Reed is his level of supernatural inclination / ability entirely unknown. I tend to think it's on the mild side, if any, but he certainly has a connection to the Isle of Faces. The Isle of Faces has a big connection to this episode. He also has a big connection to Lyanna and the Tournament of Harrenhal, which in turn might have given him a connection to Rhaegar indirectly. So Howland Reed, big part of this episode, in part as well. Here's a few other key questions that we're going to work on. Things that I think are important to answer and things that might spark other questions from you all. First of all, when? When did this all happen? Again, not long after the Tourney of Harrenhal, within a couple months. Early 282. Why was Lyanna still in the south, though? Why didn't she just go back home to the north after the Tournament of Harrenhal? What's she still doing down there? Well, it wasn't that long between Harrenhal and Lyanna's disappearance. We have what's supposedly 2 months of the fall spring before the sudden return of winter, and then Rhaegar seemingly meeting Lyanna shortly after the new year, which is when winter had started. So Lyanna probably was only in the south for another couple months at most, maybe 3 months. That's a reasonably long time, but not any crazy amount, not some strange amount that we have to really scratch our heads at. But still, why? Why was she still there? Why didn't she go back home? Rickard seemed to have gone home. Brandon, of course, had to travel to Riverrun before he got diverted, so he wasn't at Riverrun. He may have gone back north. There's potentially that's maybe why she stayed. She may have stayed in the south to attend Brandon's wedding later and not travel all the way home. But still, it's odd that she wasn't with her family. So it's possible as well that it's related to Robert. Obviously, by then she was already betrothed to Robert. She'd been betrothed to Robert for a little while, for a few years. So it's possible that was pending. That was coming soon. Rickard and Robert may have been working that out, may have been trying to decide on a date. She was 16 when she vanished, so they may have been waiting for her to turn 16. We don't know exactly when she turned 16, so it may have been around that time. They didn't seem to be waiting, except for maybe her to be at that age. Other than that, they were ready for this political arrangement, this marriage to happen. And it's interesting to consider Robert's side of this a bit, which is that Robert grew up with Ned, had a big fondness for Ned, and most of his own family was gone, right? His mother and father drowned in sight of Storm's End, famously, and so he's been Lord of Storm's End for quite a while on his own. So he didn't really have a family anymore. His elders were all gone. His family is his younger brother Stannis and Renly, and Renly's a child. And Stannis, Robert and Stannis, not the best of friends. You know, they didn't click too well. You know, as we know, their personalities are very different. So not a lot of family for Robert. So this is wrapped up in Robert's attraction to Lyanna, is joining the Stark family, being a part of that. They had a healthy, large family until they didn't. But at the time, when Robert was a teenager, they really did. He was best friends with Ned. Marrying Lyanna is just the coup de grace. He's just fully in. Best friend Stark, wife Stark. It's his extended family, the family he doesn't have on his own side. Yeah, there's a lot of squishiness in there, right? A lot of like, poor Robert, right? You know, you don't feel bad for him later in life, but I feel bad for him thinking about it in that light. So yeah, the possibility of his marriage to Lyanna is entirely a good reason, a good theory for why she was still in the South, and why maybe Brandon wasn't, because Brandon could go home to get ready for his wedding and come back. But there's definitely a lot of mystery in terms of where these people were in these ensuing months, right? Because Lyanna may not have been with her family, which is interesting. And she wasn't at River Run because there's no evidence that Catelyn has ever met her, and Catelyn was certainly just parked at River Run through all of this. So anyway, definitely some mysteries in there in terms of those months and exactly where everybody was, and that's something that I expect George to clear up at least somewhat, but probably not all the way. And another factor is after the tournament, in terms of the wedding and Robert and Lyanna, after what Rhaegar did, after he laid that wreath in her lap, very suggestively, Lance, lap, blue roses, turns into John. But they saw him do that, and they're like, maybe we better get this marriage done sooner. After, like, what's Rhaegar up to here? Maybe we should go ahead and seal this deal now before Rhaegar goes any farther than this. So let's take care of this marriage ASAP, right? That's a very possible line of thinking they had. All the more reason to have Lyanna stay in the South. So another possibility, though, is that Lyanna fled or ran away from a much farther away distance. We assume that she escaped near the Riverland. She got away from her family or was captured near her family. Because, yes, they met not, quote unquote, not 10 leagues from Harrenhal. But that doesn't mean she came a very long distance to get there. The assumption is that she wasn't that far away in the first place. But we should consider that she fled her family's party returning to the north after Harrenhal, and they had no idea where she was for quite a while. A lot of room there.
I kind of am partial to that idea that they lingered a bit after the tourney. They started their journey home, and Lyanna just ditched him. Lyanna ditched him and went south. You know what I mean? That it was on their slow progress north that she slipped away.
It makes a lot of sense. They wouldn't be necessarily expecting it. They wouldn't have any reason to be like, keep an eye on her. Like, I don't, that might not have been considering it at all. And that, it fits really well. But where, though? How did they know where to meet? Or how did Rhaegar know where she would be? Or how did he know or how did she know where he would be? Like, how did they know where each other would be, Well, if they did meet at the Tournament of Harrenhal, they had a private conversation, probably amidst the Night of the Laughing Tree and all that business. They could have arranged. They said, hey, meet me here in 2 months or 3 months. Lyanna could tell Rhaegar, meet me here in 3 months. I'll be at this particular heart tree or this particular grove, or I don't know what location they picked, but they probably picked something distinct out of the way. They're not going to pick anything clearly obvious, like the Inn of the Kneeling Man or the the Inn at the Crossroads or something where there's a lot of people. But they may have found some unique location nearby. If we're looking at the map here, the Isle of Faces is going to be one we're going to strongly consider. Maybe High Heart. There's a chance. That's close enough. But 10 leagues from Harrenhal isn't very far. That's only like 30 miles, y'all. There's not a lot of room we can't cast a huge wide net all around the area here. There's not a lot of options. So I think the Isle of Faces is the best guess for where they eventually went. Not where they met first, though, because, like, how does she even get there initially? Or how does he get there? I do think that's where they may have eventually gone. But the actual meeting spot, maybe it's not that important, but it's fun to talk about and narrow down. And when we do that, well, we realize I still don't know. So yeah, Nina definitely believes that at the Tournament of Harrenhal after the Night of the Laughing Tree incident. He goes and tracks the Night of the Laughing Tree down and finds out it's her. And then they fall for each other, but it's more than that. I do think it's more than just falling for each other because, well, we'll get to that later. I don't think it's just they're besotted with each other. It's definitely not just that simple. They're both very serious people, though I think love is a part of it. It's definitely not everything here. I don't think love alone caused them to do all these things, to cause all this political turmoil. They both, I think, believed in the prophecy. Rhaegar certainly did, and I think maybe Lyanna did eventually as well. So Nina gives us a great example. Come to the Godswood if you want to go home. Who was told that? Sansa, right? And that's the meeting, like a prearranged meeting, give you a message. She goes to the Godswood, and then Danto sneaks her out of the castle. Of course, it's Littlefinger behind all that, but it doesn't matter. Same difference. The parallel is there. Something along those lines. And I do think it would be fun if they met at some heart tree. That would be appropriate, given that a lot of this could be witnessed by the old gods. It could be Bran that shows us all this in the long term. So the heart tree having a shadow over everything, or multiple heart trees having a shadow over all this, is very appropriate. We know they went to the Tower of Joy eventually, but right now we're focused on in between, right? What did they do? Where did they go before heading south to the Tower of Joy? So again, the Isle of Faces is one of our important figures there. But before we get to that, let's talk about who else is involved. Because again, it's not just Lyanna and Rhaegar, and we've talked about other people who are affected by it. But there's other people directly involved who weren't just affected by it, but they were there or there for part of it. Obviously, Lyanna and Rhaegar, but who were Rhaegar's quote-unquote half a dozen companions? Quite possibly Miles Booton and Richard Lonmouth. They were squires to Rhaegar, who later became his companions, so he quite likely trusted them very much. Probably not Jon Connington, given that Jon never thinks about Rhaegar and Lyanna, though he does think about Rhaegar and Elia. Yeah, and Jon wanted to be closer to Rhaegar. I don't know if he ever was so close to be included in this group of a half a dozen. Certain Kingsguard would be included, though not Lewin Martell, given he's Elia's uncle. That would be very insulting to her. He's not going to be helping with any of this, like, second wife betraying his niece kind of business. Arthur Dayne is very possible. Gerald Hightower probably not, even though he ends up involved in the Tower of Joy later. We know Gerald Hightower was sent to bring Rhaegar back. He wasn't there initially, so probably not Gerald Hightower. Sir Oswell Went, very possible, because he's one of the others that dies at the Tower of Joy. He's associated with Harrenhal. I mean, his house Went. That's who ruled Harrenhal at the time. And we know that Rhaegar had a strong connection to the Wents. So that's very possibly the other Kingsguard that he trusted as much, maybe just a step down from Arthur, who I think is the most likely. Barristan Selmy, probably out of the question. He reveals in his POV that Rhaegar didn't include Barristan in his circle of trust so much. So he would have known things about Rhaegar, and he certainly knows things about Lyanna, but he wouldn't have been included in this. He wasn't there on the road. He wasn't part of the kidnapping / abduction / elopement, whatever you call it. What about on Lyanna's side? Who are her companions? Maybe she didn't have companions. If she just ran away from her family's party, then she's just by herself. Maybe she had guards that she ran away from. If so, then these are just randoms probably, that we may never have names for. But one tempting possibility, again, is the name of Howland Reed, because they became friends at the tourney at Harrenhal. She defended him, and they got to know each other. And, well, it just so happens Howland Reed had spent some time at the Isle of Faces just before the tournament, according to Mira and Jojen. So that's going to be an important point. Now, of course, Ned, somewhat involved. Brandon, somewhat involved. Benjen is a big question, though. Nina says definitely. She thinks definitely Benjen was involved. He may have helped her escape. He may have helped her by concealing the secret. He may have known what she was going to do and kept that hidden.
I think that's why he joined the Wall. I think he felt very guilty over this. I think you and I have speculated on this before in some Benjen episode once. But I think we both agreed that He's probably felt bad about what happened because he knew. Yeah,
I think you're right. I think he helped this thing happen that he decided was helping his sister avoid a bad marriage. Like, that's probably all it seemed like it was. Like, she doesn't want to marry this guy, and that seems like something you would help your sister do. Like, you would be on her side for that. Like, your dad's making her marry this man that she doesn't like, and we know Robert's a womanizer, and like maybe they're on her side. Like, yeah, it's not right. So Ned wouldn't have helped with that because Ned was so close to Robert, but Benjen might have. So yeah, I can see guilt having a lot to do with his decisions and why he joined the Watch. Now the Tullys again could be involved a little bit, but they're more likely they're just impacted by it. But I wanted to mention them because it's possible that House Went is the ones that informed the Tullys. That's their liege lord, their kin. Remember, Catelyn's mother is a Went, or was a Went. And this disappearance happened, if it's not 10 leagues from Harrenhal, it's probably their jurisdiction, like their lands. So this happened in their territory, which, you know how these lords think. If it happens on their territory, someone else is going to say they're responsible for it. So that matters a lot too, even, and that may have been part of why things went the way they did with Oswell, why he was so intent on helping Rhaegar and defending baby Jon Snow or whatever. So, of course, the actual impact is much larger than this. I'm sure if we really dove even deeper, we could find second and third degree impacts and characters who are even more involved. Maybe some people that could have been involved, servants, squires here and there that I didn't consider. Feel free to weigh in on that because there is a lot of wiggle room here. Let's move on to the section called Why Not an Abduction. So with respect to what we still don't know about what transpired between them at the tourney, what kind of conversation they had, why Lyanna chose Rhaegar, let's say she did go willingly or because she had her own plans, like escaping Robert. That's the obvious one. So that is, of course, where we should start. It's perhaps our best reason for why Lyanna on her own would want to go with Rhaegar willingly. Let's take Nina's lead here. She thinks that Lyanna was in a bind. She didn't want to marry Robert. She believed Robert would never love her, and she didn't have a way to stop it. She's a teenage girl in a patriarchal society. I mean, a teenage boy probably couldn't do much here either, but still, she has very limited means to do anything about it. Her father had already agreed to it. Ned was trying to sell her on it. Ned liked Robert. He was trying to push her into it. Not push her into it, but argue her into it. He's biased towards Robert. Even after everything, Ned is biased towards Robert a bit in ways that I think are a little unfair.
He
but
could
you
have
know,
married him.
Ned and Robert should have gotten married instead. That would have solved it all, right? So Lyanna couldn't say no, right? Like it's not like Sansa, or it is like Sansa in A Storm of Swords, where she just really doesn't want to marry Tyrion. Before that, she really didn't want to marry Joffrey. So for her, it was like trading one bad option for another. Until she got a chance to run away. That was her one option that came up that she was able to take. So what Sansa hasn't done, but is on track to perhaps do, is get remarried. And at that point, she can re-emerge. She can be Sansa again, potentially, because then she's married. As patriarchal, as entrapping as a lot of these marriages can be for women, that can be used against this scenario too. This can be used as a weapon. She can turn it around like judo. If she gets out of it by marrying someone else, then that's done. If it's like, yeah, I mean, sure, there's ways around this, like Tywin can annul Tyrion's marriage to Tysha because she's lowborn. But if Lyanna runs off and marries Rhaegar, that's not going to get annulled so easily, right? This is the Crown Prince. He can defy Lord of Winterfell and the Lord of Storm's End if he wants to. He can get away with that. It might not be easy, but he can do it, and he already tried. I mean, he look at what he did in front of everybody at the tournament. He put that wreath right in her lap. So he was clearly willing to do things like this. So on her end, she sees his bravery. He's willing to step up for her. He's her way out. He's her way. Look, if I can go marry Robert, if I can just not marry Robert, if I can get to Rhaegar, marry him, I'm out of Robert's reach. He can't do anything about it. As powerful as he is, Lord of Storm's End, that marriage is final, done before the sight of gods and men. You can't do anything about it, Robert. That's it. So that's her out. That's her way to get out of it. So it really makes sense that that's why she would be all over this idea. Prophecy or no, whether she believed in any of that stuff, it doesn't matter. This is her way out of the marriage she didn't want, and to perhaps one of the few people that could really make sure that marriage wasn't, there was no chicanery to get rid of it, like a Tywin Tysha thing. And Rhaegar as well came from a history of polygamous marriages, not recent ones, but the precedent was there. So they thought maybe, yeah, this is chintzy legal grounds, but it's not without precedent. They at least have an angle to take to justify it. It's a little out of the ordinary, maybe a lot out of the ordinary, but they could probably get it to work, especially given who Rhaegar is. And how about that, too? It actually comes around again. Robb, who, of course, is Lyanna's nephew, he cites one of these exact same polygamous brides to justify his marriage. He uses the royal credentials of Jane Westerling, who was one of Maegor's black brides. Really, that's a polygamous marriage. Jane Westerling was not Maegor's first wife, to support the credentials of his Jane Westerling, right? Maegor married a Jane Westerling and Robb married a Jane Westerling. So, now if you look at literature, real world, fiction, fantasy, even just A Song of Ice and Fire, you can find lots of other examples of women escaping marriages by marrying someone else first. It doesn't matter the religion, doesn't matter the time setting. For the most part, this is a trope that maybe it's not right to call it a trope because, yeah, it happens in the real world. The finality of it all is what makes it work. He's like, nope, marriage is final. So if you flip that around, well, Lyanna's married, Robert. You can't do anything about it. That's it. The gods have spoken, you know? Now, you can't marry someone that's already married unless, of course, you kill the new husband. But we're talking about Rhaegar. Not so easy to kill. Okay, technically, Robert did actually kill Rhaegar. That actually did happen. But we know a lot more happened in between then and later, and Lyanna died afterwards. So shortly afterwards. So it's not like he won her in that sense, quote unquote. Even the Red Kraken makes this claim. He takes a bunch of salt wives during the Dance of the Dragons from the West mostly, and they're demanded back. He's like, send them back. You know, the crown demands their return, and he's like, I married him. What the drowned god has put together, no man can set asunder. Even they go with that. I mean, of course, it's a very self-serving line. He's mocking the Seven Kingdoms by saying that, but it's a strong argument in this world that what the gods have joined, no man can separate, even when it's the drowned god. So, yeah, this is a ubiquitous type of scenario, type of situation. So, yeah. They met, again, presumably when he was looking for the Night of the Laughing Tree again, and realized that they are the answer to each other's problems. Lyanna says, whether she's in on the prophecy or not, she has her way out of this marriage, which is the thing that she wants. And Rhaegar has the means to create the third head of the dragon. Now, why she is the right one out of the seemingly other choices of women he could have made. Still, this is what's right in front of him. Maybe there's reasons we're not aware of. It certainly works. Now, there could be other reasons, but we have enough just with that to establish a good reason for them to do what they did. So that's the willingness. We have plenty of motive here, but how? Again, we talked about the possibility that she just ran off from her friends, but let's get a little deeper with that. Let's get a little deeper into that possibility. It's easier to answer this question when we don't think it's an abduction, or when we do think it is an abduction, rather, because he fell on their party, as the other quote said. Okay, he kidnaps her and runs away with it. What more is there to say? That's pretty straightforward. But it doesn't seem to work, right? Not only is there so much counter evidence for it being an abduction, he only had half a dozen companions, like, overpowered them with 6 guys? Like, was she really that lightly defended? I don't know. It just... There's no mention of anyone being killed, so yeah, again, just doesn't seem to work. So they met probably at a prearranged location, as we keep saying, and again, a factor that's told to us about her looms very large here. George R. R. Martin wrote her as an amazing horsewoman, horse rider, horse person. Even Roose Bolton, of all people, comments on how talented Lyanna was at riding horses. We have a lot of mentions of it. So we have a very straightforward trait of hers.
The real term is horse girl.
Horse girl.
Horse
yeah,
girl.
She's a horse girl, yeah. Lyanna's a horse girl, yeah. She's a legendary horse girl, that's right. So if it came to some sort of chase, Lyanna's who's going to catch her? Not the Kingsguard, not her father, not her brothers. She's faster than everyone. So, yeah. This brings us to a beautiful and sneaky as heck potential parallel here in the form of an Arya quote.
I need to find the fields again. I need to find a road. Instead, she found a game trail. It was narrow and uneven, but it was something. She raced along it, branches whipping at her face. One snagged her hood and yanked it back, and for half a heartbeat, she feared they had caught her. A vixen burst from the brush as she passed, startled by the fury of her flight. The game trail brought her to another stream. Or was it the same one? Had she gotten turned around? There was no time to puzzle it out. She could hear their horses crashing through the trees behind her. Thorns scratched at her face like the cats she used to chase in King's Landing. Sparrows exploded from the branches of an alder, but the trees were thinning now, and suddenly she was out of them. Broad level fields stretched before her, all weeds and wild wheat, sodden and trampled. Arya kicked her horse back to a gallop. Run, she thought. Run, she thought. Run for River Run. Run for home. Had she lost them? She took one quick look, and there was Harwin 6 yards back and gaining. No, she thought. No, he can't. Not him. It isn't fair. Both horses were lathered and flagging by the time he came up beside her, reached over, and grabbed her bridle. Arya was breathing hard herself then. She knew the fight was done. You ride like a Northman, milady, Harwin said when he'd drawn them to a halt. Your aunt was the same, Lady Lyanna. But my father was master of horse, remember?
So yeah, right? That's amazing. Lyanna's own flight may have been quite similar, even with stark men riding after her. She may have even gone out riding as a means to bait them, as a means to set up her escape. Just a normal thing for her to do. She's a horse girl. She'd have guards with her, given who she is. I mean, she's a highborn lady, you know. But then she just bolts all of a sudden. They're not ready for it. They don't expect it. They don't know what she's got planned. And she races to that spot where she knew Rhaegar would be, or where Rhaegar knew she would be. And they don't know where that place is. So once she gets out of sight, once she's gone, she has a reasonable expectation of losing them entirely. Now, of course, the difference here is Arya was caught and Lyanna was not. There was no Harwin, son of Holland, to catch her, if that's indeed how it went. Arya, of course, did eventually escape this as well. She traded one captor for another. She traded the Brotherhood Without Banners for Sandor Clegane, which is kind of what Arya did, or Lyanna did. She traded a potential Robert for Rhaegar, right? And another Jane Westerling parallel here that Nina caught. When Robb leaves for the twins, Jane is so desperate to not be parted from him that she catches up with him at the outskirts of Tumbleton. Like, they've already ridden away from River Run, and she catches up on a, quote, well-lathered horse, having fled River Run to beg him to take her with him. Parallel power there. And given that Jane's mother was keeping a close eye on her, Jane clearly escaped to do that. Because remember, Jane's mother is like keeping her back and is giving her abortion drugs and all this stuff. So she definitely doesn't want her to sneak out and catch Robb, but she did it. And Jane is no Lyanna in terms of horse riding. So she's maybe a horse girl also, but safe assumption she's not as talented and skilled as Lyanna. So again, it's just one possible scenario here. There's a lot of other ways Lyanna could have escaped or run away or eluded her guards or who knows. But it just feels kind of right to include her horsemanship as a factor in her escape. Like, it feels like that's a part of why George gave her that trait. It was that it gives her an ability to run off like she did. It's also extra proof she wasn't abducted, right? If she didn't want to go with Rhaegar, how are you going to capture this woman? She gets away, right? She's going to ride off. Like, again, I just pointed out how her own men wouldn't be able to catch her, her own guards, her own family. Same goes for Rhaegar's guys, right? Miles Mooton's not catching her, right? Arthur Dane's an incredible swordsman, but I doubt he could outrace Lyanna. So this is more proof that she went where she wanted. Because she would have if she can get away, she can get away from him too. Once with Rhaegar, though, that is kind of like a safety net. When she gets to him, she can kind of hide behind him and say, look, if you want to take me back, you got to go through him. Are you really going to go after the crown prince? Well, if you're Robert, you might. If you're Brandon, you might. But that's not who was there at the time. Brandon was not there, you know. So if you're not Brandon or Robert, you see Rhaegar with Lyanna and you think something's wrong, you're not going to draw swords. He's got his Kingsguard with him. He's the crown prince. You might be puzzled, but you're not going to go after him. You're not going to attack him. You might tell somebody, though. But they probably traveled in secret. They probably kept things under wraps. They traveled off the beaten path. I don't know. Because again, there's a big gap before this event and how they got to the Tower of Joy. Probably did that in secret. And of course, Rhaegar eventually comes back to command the armies that he might should have done sooner and then die at the Trident. Coming up next, we'll discuss this in between. From their disappearance to their possible marriage and where. If you are enjoying our content, I highly suggest you come support us on Patreon. It's a big podcasting world out there these days. We've been around for a long time. We've watched the world grow around us. The podcasting industry has changed a lot. It's had its ups and downs. It's mostly growing, but you know, it's a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of process like so many other ones are. And for that reason, we really value your support because it's the one thing we can really count on. Spotify, Apple, you know, all these other, Amazon, all these big companies, they're going to do what they do. They're giant corporations. We just kind of have to play along. We don't really have a choice. They own all the servers and all the platforms. But what's between you all and us is separate from that. We don't have to engage with them for support from our fans, from our listeners like you all. That's what Patreon is for. It's a much smaller site. It's not some giant corporation. And we are appreciative that we have a place like that we can do this, that we can have a central repository for our bonus episodes, for our scripts, for having polls to keep you up to date with what we're doing. So we get a lot back when you sign up for Patreon. You get a lot out of it, but if you listen to us regularly, seems like a fair exchange, right? So check us out at patreon.com/History of Westeros. We got a lot of different levels you can sign up at. Like I said, bonus episodes, that's probably the biggest
About to have one
biggest
drop.
draw. Yeah, we have a bonus episode. Sort of mentioned earlier. I mentioned the Red Kraken earlier in this episode. That is the episode we're about to have drop. Patrons only episode. It is sort of Red Kraken 2, but it's called The Kraken, the Lion, and the Seahorse. Or the Lioness. The Lioness. The Kraken, and the Seahorse. I got the order wrong. Lioness, Kraken, Seahorse. Lioness being Lady Joanna Westerling. Not to be confused with Jane Westerling, but same family. And, of course, the Red Kraken. And the Seahorse being Alan Velaryon. So it's an excellent story that takes place sort of in conjunction with the Dance of the Dragons, but is separate enough from it that the story deserves to be told separately. So there you go. Lots of things are awaiting for you, and as well as just the satisfaction of supporting one of your hopefully regular listen shows like us. Also, check us out on Twitch. You know, I do been building up a lot of steam over there. Pretty regularly stream at Friday at 6 o'clock Eastern. We're playing the A Song of Ice and Fire mod for Crusader Kings. It's super well detailed. Right now we're playing House Corbray. We reformed the religion a little bit. We reformed the Face of the Seven to have a Corbray feel to it. We had a really outstanding religious figure who was able to pull that off. It's a difficult thing to do, reforming the Faith of the Seven, but only in their area. The Faith of the Seven is still dominant in the rest of the world, so we've got a lot of work to do, but it's been a lot of fun doing that. Question from Guilty Undertaker. Also, there's a parallel with Alice Karstark fleeing to the wall and Jon arranging her marriage to Sigorn. Good catch. We happen to have that one in our notes for the end. If we do have enough time for the parallels, we'll be mentioning that one, but very good catch. I'd love to see y'all catch some of these things as well.
I like that one because it intersects with Jon.
Yeah, and she thinks it's Arya.
Yeah,
like when she was the number one Lyanna parallel.
Yeah, I feel of all the examples of a woman marrying a man to escape another man, this is one of the strongest parallels because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, and it's almost the similarities there are pretty huge too, because her uncle wants to marry her and he's awful. He's not as, he's more awful than Robert. Robert is maybe would have been a bad husband, but this guy would have probably killed Alice, so that's the way Robert probably wouldn't have done that. Wasn't that bad. So a question of marriage. Several of you all sent questions about this section, about whether there was a marriage and where it might have taken place. So shout outs to a couple of y'all who sent questions in, Randomir Mitra as well, and a couple of the rest of y'all. Appreciate the questions. Right before Ned Stark relives the Tower of Joy in the streets of King's Landing, when he fights the Kingsguard, Jaime Lannister, his party of 3 kills 7 of Jaime's men. Very suspicious numbering there, George. Right before this, he thinks of something Lyanna said to him. Quote,
Robert will never keep to one bed, Lyanna had told him at Winterfell, on the night long ago when their father had promised her hand to the young lord of Storm's End. I hear he has gotten a child on some girl in the Vale. Ned had held the babe in his arms. He could scarcely deny her, nor would he lie to his sister, but he had assured her that what Robert did before their betrothal was of no matter, that he was a good man and true, who would love her with all his heart. Lyanna had only smiled. Love is sweet, dearest Ned, but it cannot change a man's nature.
His reputation preceded him even back then. Yeah, and he did have a child, of course. That's Mia Stone. We know exactly who that is. And side note, by the way, so far, I believe this is the only Lyanna quote we have, except for, of course, promise me, Ned. So these are the only lines we have from her. And there's like 3 sentences here, and promise me, Ned is the only other line we get from her. So, again, this is what I was talking about earlier when I said this puts a dent in the notion that Lyanna married Rhaegar solely for love. What does she just say here? Love is sweet, dearest Ned, but it cannot change a man's nature. This is not some frivolous teenager. These are not the words of a person that's just lost to love and just thinks about marriage. And this is not young Sansa here. This is a much more mature person here than you might normally think when you hear 16-year-old girl or 16-year-old anyone. Gender doesn't matter here. It's just you won't expect necessarily a young person to speak with this maturity and with this insight. Love is sweet. Who says that when they're 16, in that way? That's a very mature and kind of dark almost. Like, yeah, she was really, really didn't want to marry Robert. I think this can't be understated. And Ned also tells Robert personally, you saw her beauty, but not the iron underneath. Again, George, very telling, because think about how George uses metal as a metaphor. We've seen Stannis iron will break before she bends. And indeed, she ran off. She broke before she bent, for sure. She was not giving up. She's not going, oh, well, I got no choice. I'm marrying Robert. What choice do I have? No, she took her only chance, the chance that most women wouldn't be able to take or wouldn't be capable of taking or would not dare to take. But they're not. Most people, again, gender aside, most people do not have the quote-unquote iron underneath that Ned saw in his sister. That was one of the many reasons he loved her and respected her. So I think this is kind of a under-the-radar, underlooked possibility for Lyanna, is that her own interests are very important here. This isn't just she's fell for Rhaegar, ran off with him, and got screwed up and mixed into this prophecy, and it all went bad for her. Who really thinks George R. Martin made it that simple? Come on. He's never that simple. I think that love was a part of it. I think it was a big part of it. But it was, if anyone out there says it's the only thing, I will disagree with you. I will disagree with you strenuously. So there was pragmatic stuff in play here. Prophecy, getting away from Robert. They both had something they wanted. And yes, there was an initial attraction, which was the anchor to all this. They knew they could maybe build a little something to this. They wanted to be together. So yes, there was a little bit of wishful, but there was also a little bit of, this is the thing that will fix the problem that both of us had before we even met each other. And yeah, I mean, on the other side though, I mean, she was a bit of a romantic. There's definitely that element to her. There was definitely some of that here. Again, I'm not trying to squash that idea at all. I just think it's not a standalone idea. I don't think it was alone. I mean, after all, Lyanna cried when she heard Rhaegar singing. Right. And then her brothers teased her and she hit them, So, there's nuance here, right? These are George R. R. Martin characters. They're not simple. They're not straightforward. They don't just all work the same way. They don't all just go the same way. They don't all do the same things. Yeah. There's a lot to do with this here. So we don't have to assume Rhaegar intended to marry her at first. That's the part that maybe she brought to the table. Maybe he just needed the third child and didn't care about marriage. Like, to him, the marriage isn't important. Again, his second son, or his second child, is the one that he's focused on here. His third child for him is just supporting the efforts of his son.
Yeah, why would it matter to him if a girl supporting his male son is a bastard?
Yeah, I can't come up with a reason why that would matter at all. So again, it seems like the marriage part, that's Lyanna. That's the part that she needs out of this deal, because she doesn't want to have to be forced to marry Robert. That's her escape. So it's almost like that's her leverage. She's like, okay, you want me to, we love each other. You want me to bear this third head of the dragon? Okay, then marry me. That's what I need from you to make this happen. We'll both give, we'll both compromise. You give this, I give that. And the thing I need from you is a marriage. I need that ring, so I don't have to marry that stupid Robert guy, right? I think that's highly logical, makes a lot of sense, and is a better idea than Rhaegar wanting a marriage, because we can't come up with a good reason for why he would want that. It doesn't really fit. All he needs is another kid. It doesn't have to be trueborn. This is a guy who didn't care about politics. So what does he care about, trueborn or not trueborn? What does that even matter and we're talking about prophecy. The princess that was promised doesn't call for trueborn children. Certainly not, especially given that looks like Jon, who might be part of the Azor Ahai conundrum, is potentially not trueborn, potentially is, and that's what we're talking about now. Isn't that kind of funny that we barely mentioned Jon Snow to this point? We're very focused on Rhaegar and Lyanna before that point. But obviously Jon Snow is technically one of the characters deeply impacted by all this. Just, after the fact. Dornish Dame mentions that scene also makes her think of Ygritte as a parallel to Lyanna, the spearwife who cried at the song about the death of the race of giants. Yeah. There was also some taunting, a little gentle mockery. Ygritte kind of like smacked Jon for wondering why she was crying about that. He didn't quite get it. But yeah, that's really good. That's really good. And Jon kind of ran off with Ygritte in a way, and the Blue Rose story is part of their tale. Like Ygritte and him talk about the Blue Bard, or the Blue Bard. That's not the reference I meant. The Blue Rose Bale the Bard. That's where I was going with that. Yeah. Guilty Undertaker says, was Lyanna crying just because Rhaegar's song was so beautiful, or because she had dreamed of what was to come and knew what it meant? Yeah, I like this question. I've considered it too. Like, there's no strong evidence or evidence at all that Lyanna had any sort of dreams or supernatural anything going on. Rhaegar may have as well. Like, Rhaegar might have had dreams. Either of them could have had dreams. So we have to leave that as an open question. There's definitely nothing that just says, yeah, Lyanna had a conduit to the old gods. She was having dreams. Nothing tells us that. She's a Stark, though, which means it's possible. So we can't eliminate it, but
Not to be overly influenced by House of the Dragon's TV canon, but even someone could not be a dreamer per se and still be exposed to the prophecy or to dreams through a heart tree if that were the case, that she saw something but didn't normally dream. That's
a good point. I mean, we have seen non-dreamers have pretty powerful dreams, like Theon and Jaime. And
yeah, you're right. Even in the books, we've seen that. So yeah, she could have not normally been a dreamer, but slept somewhere weird and had a funky dream.
Put her head on a weirwood stump, She's out in the wild sometimes. That could have happened, yeah. So yeah, it's absolutely possible. Maybe she had heard the song before in her dreams, and it was like, holy crap, I'm hearing it again. But either way, the specifics are lost to us, or if they even exist. But it's a good theory. It's a good idea. Something we should keep in mind as a possibility. Especially as we move forward into some other supernatural options here. I also want to remind you all about Rise software. It has been really good for us, keeping us focused. One thing it's really useful for is single-click identifying is what is a distraction to you and what is work. For example, for me, I look at YouTube for work purposes sometimes, and Rise once asked me, "Hey, are you sure you want to do this? Shouldn't you be working right now?" And I'm like, "No, actually, this is work. I'm watching other videos relevant to them, watching history videos and stuff that's helping me learn about whatever topic I was researching at the time." And that's really useful to me. If you're like me at all, you're scatterbrained. The modern world with the internet, 25 tabs open at a time, it is really hard not to be, ooh, shiny thing over there, shiny thing over here. That is me. It's amazing I get any episode written ever given that. But Rise is very helpful in just reminding me to keep that narrow view. Don't get too distracted. It's fine to let your imagination wander. It's helpful sometimes to writing episodes, but too much of that, and I'm just, next thing I know, I'm reading about something completely unrelated to anything, and I'm definitely not working.
Yeah, for me, there's all sorts of times where I start working on some tech thing, and it's not really that important. Really, it's not pressing compared to my other work, and Rise will be like, is this a distraction? And I do have to sit and take stock. I'm like, well, this is kind of a work, but it's not the work that I need to be doing right now. It is a distraction. Let me pivot back to the time-sensitive work that I have. So I love Rise. It's indispensable to me.
Not only does it help you focus, but it helps you prioritize, like decide what is the most important, decide what is most highest priority versus low priority. So yeah, very useful, and it's very affordable. You can go to Rise, you can follow the link in the description and use the code Westeros3 to get 25% off all payments within the first 3 months. And yeah, Rise is pretty affordable. And
Rise with a Z.
With a Z, yes. Important note there. Small subscription fee to increase your productivity. Easy call in my opinion. If it works even a little bit, that's a very good trade-off. All right, where and how? We looked at the map earlier and we took note of how little there is that's obvious for a candidate for where they met. But again, the meeting place is perhaps less important than what came immediately next before the Tower of Joy, which is the potential of a marriage. So where did they get married? Again, the Isle of Faces is by far our best candidate. And okay, but how? How did they go to the gods? How do they go to the Isle of Faces, and why would they go to the Isle of Faces?
The wedding Isle of Faces.
It's the wedding Isle of Faces. That's good. Well, they needed to have witnesses, and they couldn't bring, anyone else over because no one could know about this. So it's one of the very few places south of the Neck where there are still wild weirwoods growing, and they can't go to some other castle gods would. They're trying to be secret. So where do they go? Like, what choice do they have? If they're trying to get married, and let's not go to the show, for an example. I actually think the show did a good job with the Tower of Joy, but with the Lyanna Rhaegar stuff in general, not so much. Not good at all. They didn't understand their relationship. They didn't understand a lot of the setup. They missed a bajillion parallels. So the idea that it was written down in a book, let alone discovered by anybody, is silly because the whole point was them keeping it a secret. Why would it be written down? There was no septon present. A septon makes no sense. A, because its septon is a witness. B, because neither of them care about the faith of the seven here. If Lyanna's the one pushing the wedding, then she gets married in an old god ceremony. That's her call. She's the one pushing for the marriage. It would be under her faith. And Rhaegar doesn't. And if Rhaegar's pushing the marriage, then he probably doesn't matter which type of wedding they have. He just needs them to be married. But again, we have very little reason to suspect Rhaegar was the one pushing for the wedding. So again, focus on Lyanna here. If it's her marriage, her demand, her escape from Robert, and it's going to be under the auspices of her religion. And there's the spot right there. They're not far from the Isle of Faces. They're already pretty close by. And they're very unceremonial. We see Jane, fake Arya, Jane Poole, and Ramsay's wedding at A Dance with Dragons. And they kneel and they pray, and there's silence and cloaking of the bride in her husband's cloak. And that's about it. Everything else is kind of quiet observance, and it doesn't require witnesses. Sometimes it does. I mean, there were witnesses at Jane and Ramsay's wedding, but they didn't have to be there. The heart tree was the only witness that really mattered. So yeah, definitely throw away the show ideas from this and focus on what makes a lot more sense for Lyanna. The Septon idea makes no sense, but the Isle of Faces, weirwoods, heart trees, that makes a lot of sense. It explains the lack of witnesses. It fits Lyanna's belief. And if it was Rhaegar pushing it, it's a polygamous marriage. They wouldn't do that under the Seven. You wouldn't have a polygamous marriage under the Seven, right? He could put his black and red dragon cloak over her shoulders under the watch of numerous heart trees.
I mean, didn't all the previous Targaryen polygamous marriages happen under the Seven? They didn't do it under Valyrian.
That's true. They did it under the doctrine of exceptionalism,
Yeah,
but that had kind of fallen off. So I guess you could have done it, but
like they would have had a septon at all of those marriages, for example. So they were just kind of their own little forked thing. But
so don't think there was a septon here. So maybe the Rhaegar 7 thing isn't the best part of this argument, but there's enough else here that makes it pretty straightforward, I think, and it's difficult to gainsay this option. Now, again, this is where we come back to Howland Reed. Because, first of all, this once again supports the idea that it was Lyanna's idea to get married, because Rhaegar, Isle of Faces, what's his connection to that? Like, he doesn't have that connection. She does. And why does she have that? Not just because she's an old god worshiper, that's not enough. Because she has a connection to Howland. Rewind a bit. What happens? Howland Reed, we're told he goes to the Isle of Faces a year before the Tournament of Harrenhal, or a winter before the Tournament of Harrenhal. Quite a while before the Tournament of Harrenhal. Stays there all through winter. All through winter, he's on the Isle of Faces, according to Mira and Jojen. Then he departs the Isle of Faces to go to the tournament. He's there all that time, and this is what he leaves for, to go to the tournament. He gets beaten up by those squires. Lyanna comes on the scene, scatters the squires, says, "Hey, you're attacking my father's man," and brings him to her tent, tends his wounds, treats him well. They get to chatting, whatever. Maybe this is when Ned meets him. Who knows? Somehow, throughout all this, we get a potential that Lyanna has gone to the Isle of Faces. So at some point, he told her about it, would be the expectation, or the answer, the thing that settles this or connects these 2 points. So he's her way to access the Isle, because maybe the winds would blow her away or the ravens would drive her off. That's what we're normally told happens when someone tries to sail there. But Howland has already been there. We know he's allowed. So if he brings Lyanna and Rhaegar with him, he's the ambassador to the Isle, for lack of a better term. He's the way they could get there. So again, that wouldn't be through Rhaegar. That would be through Lyanna, through her connection to him. So they have permission to be there, in other words, through Howland's invite, or however that works. He's the conduit to making that happen. And this may have added to the whole, prophetic nature, to the whole, this is where we're doing the right thing here. Rhaegar is introduced to some supernatural elements that maybe he's not that familiar with. The old gods are approving of this, seemingly. They're like, yes, join them together. We approve of what you're doing. And if we get really meta, they would support potentially stopping the others. That might be what is also amongst their wishes. So they might be supportive of this for deep meta supernatural reasons. And so that might have had a lot of meaning to him outside of just the marriage. The fact that even the old gods seem to be supporting his quest to support the prince, what was promised, at first thinking it was him, then thinking it's his son, and whatever he thinks he's doing to avert the end of humanity, the old gods might be supportive of that. And again, as I referred earlier, all this really sets up the idea that Bran can see it by looking through the werewoods into the past and just seeing Lyanna and Rhaegar standing right there as they're being married in front of the heart tree. Apart from Howland Reed and witness to the wedding, there could be, and apart from the heart trees, maybe there were green men there. Maybe there were, maybe not visible. Maybe they were observing hidden. One question we got was whether there would have been any of the creepy stuff, like sacrifice or the other things we hear about happening during the pact, the sacrifice and binding to the trees, maybe drinking the Jojen paste kind of things. I don't think this is this kind of marriage. They're not being married to the trees. Bran was being wed to the trees. They're being wed by the trees. Again, we use Ramsay and Jane Poole's wedding as an example. We've seen a northern wedding. The blood stuff, apparently, if it ever was a part of that, doesn't seem to be now. So I think there's a difference here. There's the wedded to the trees, which is what Bran did, which involves the sacrifice and the blood and the magic. This is more of a just having the trees be stand-ins as priests, as the person performing the wedding. I'm not saying there isn't a supernatural element to it, but I don't think the actual union involves blood sacrifice. So, as another kind of side note to Howland Reed here, much is made of Ned and Howland, but the more I think about it, the more I think this is about Howland and Lyanna. That when Howland went to the Tower of Joy with Ned, it was for her, not for him. It could be both, but I think it's becoming pretty clear, if it wasn't already, that his relationship with her was the important one. Not that it was romantic, I'm saying, of course not. She marries Rhaegar, etc. But what she did for him was something that he was very grateful for. And it created a bond between them, very likely, that lasted and may have been crucial to this whole thing. Howland could have been with her. He could have helped her escape. He could have been this crucial element to their engagement / wedding, the actual ceremony, right? So it's also possible that Howland has the same guilt Benjen has. Remember, Benjen joined the Watch after all this, and there's lots of speculation, as we had in this episode, that he did so because he felt guilty. Howland as well could be in that spot. He has not left the Neck since returning home after the Tower of Joy. So Benjen, Ashara Dane as well, may have killed herself because she might have been the reason that Ned found the Tower of Joy, which led to the death of her own brother. She might feel responsible for that. So Howland might feel responsible for Lyanna too, because he helped her get married to Rhaegar, and look how that turned out. It all backfired so horribly. So he could feel the same level of guilt or a similar level of guilt as someone like Benjen or Ashara. Just a lot of tragedy surrounding these characters. Again, we come back to the point that this is so personal for so many people in a dramatically different level of ways. Like this, compare this level of guilt to the anger of Cersei for being called Lyanna in bed. She doesn't know Lyanna personally. She doesn't care, but she sure has a reason to hate Robert's attraction to her and Robert's obsession with her because it was so thrown in her face so much. You know, you don't have to like Cersei to recognize that as a pretty crappy thing. That is a horrible thing to have happen on your wedding night. Like truly horrible. Like really just terrible. So, okay, so once they're married though, that might be it for the important speculation on what happened between then and Tower of Joy. It may have just gone, okay, we're married now. Let's go to the Tower of Joy and have a kid.
Let's bang.
Let's bang.
That's
Tower
what
of Joy.
Next, actually.
Talk about joy. Yeah, it's the. So he knew about this place already. He knew it was obscure. Remember, folks, the Tower of Joy, that's not the name of it. That is Rhaegar's nickname for it. It is just some obscure, nameless watchtower. Which is proof that they were evading consequences, which is proof that they didn't want to be found. They knew that they needed to hide until it was time to ask for forgiveness, right? It's totally a case of better to ask for forgiveness than permission. Because if you ask his father, hey, Dad, can I run off with my second wife for a while to go make a child? I don't think that would have gone over very well. But as it turned out, it went pretty badly anyway. Because they were so secretive, because they were hiding, because no one knew where they were, well, that was a problem. Because Rhaegar was needed. He needed to come back. He needed to rally the Targaryens. He needed to rally their vassals, their banners. Like a lot of them were just sitting on the fence going, uh-oh, Civil War's breaking out. Maybe we should just ride this out. If Rhaegar was there, rallying people, a lot more of them might have been on his side. They might not have turned to Robert. The rebels got a lot of momentum while Rhaegar was in the south. If they had been able to find him, he might have come back sooner, but because he hid so effectively from his own people, whoops. This also might have kept them from knowing what happened. They might not have known about the executions. They might not have known that Brandon said, come out and die. And that led to Brandon's death and Rickard's death. They might have been completely unaware of that for several months. They had to have learned about it eventually. They learned the war was going on. They learned that, and they brought Rhaegar back. He went to the war and died facing Robert. But before that, we cannot assume they knew anything about what was happening in the north because they were hiding. They were trying to not hear anything. And they didn't want anyone to know where they were. So how was news going to reach them? If not, yeah, if Rhaegar knew and still stayed there, well, it just speaks to how he was focused on the prophecy and having this third child more so than anything else. The politics didn't matter. He figured, whatever happens there doesn't matter. Even civil war maybe was something that he might have just said, well, that's still less important. Probably not, though, because that's why he rode north to stop it. He did eventually say, okay, I gotta go. So that's really big deal. It's understandable secrecy given what they're trying to do, but it was misguided and really backfired. So let's go deeper into that backfiring, the fallout, we're calling it here, the impact for other characters, houses, and such. Again, I have to remind us that actual truth matters far less than perceived truth in cases like this. People are acting on what they think is the truth. And again, most people think that Rhaegar kidnapped Lyanna. And that caused a lot of damage, stoked the flames of rebellion that were already there. Again, Robert arranged the marriage to Lyanna himself. It wasn't arranged by his parents. He chose her himself. It's easy to forget that because of his age and all that, but this is part of that block against Aerys, the Southron ambitions, the northern marriages and all that. But for Robert, may not have seen it that way. It just, for Rickard, it slotted in there perfectly, so he would have been all for it. He might have been hoping something like that happened in the first place. Like, well, which of the great houses in the South can I marry Lyanna to? It worked itself out. Robert chose her, and he's like, that's perfect. Obviously, it wasn't perfect, but it would have seemed perfect to Rickard at the time. The initial impetus was pretty simple. Robert fell for Lyanna, and Ned indicates that it was mostly about her looks. He was into her because of what she looked like and her personality. She was brave, and Robert respects bravery, but he didn't really know her. And as much as Ned defends Robert, he doesn't really think they knew each other very well. Well, I guess he thinks Lyanna knew Robert better than Robert knew Lyanna. So they're probably a little worried, right? As well at the Tournament of Harrenhal. They have all these plans to marry various Southron lords' daughters and sons to each other, and including Rickard. All these marriages, all these entangling alliances were important for their block to restrain Aerys or to move against him, perhaps. And what were they going to be thinking about with Rhaegar, like, trying to steal Lyanna away from that? That throws off all their plans. It's like a domino effect. So they're like, wait, does he know? Is he doing this to throw off our plans? They must have been kind of paranoid about what this meant. All the while ignorant to the fact that it's a prophecy that is what's really driving him here. They probably had no clue. Or if they did, they didn't understand what that was all about. Like, prophecy? What do you mean? Like, and it might not matter to them even if they did, because the bottom line is still, the political situation is still, that doesn't change given knowledge of the prophecy. They're like, oh, Rhaegar's trying to save the world. In that case, it doesn't matter that, this political alliance against Aerys is blowing up right before our faces because of this unexpected marriage, because this daughter of Lord Stark isn't participating in our grand plan of creating a bunch of alliances through marriages. Nope. So it really threw them for a loop. They're like, what is Rhaegar doing? And even if he's not throwing us off on purpose, he's throwing us off. So Stark, Aaron, Tully, and also Martell on their own, because they're not connected to this block, but they are, of course, connected to Rhaegar through marriage. So they'd also be wondering what the heck is going on here. So that's a lot of fallout just from that. But there's more. Let's focus on the Martells a little more. First of all, very insulting. We know from George's writings, outside of the books, that basically he described the scene to the artist, and he's like, I want these characters to be recognizable, and I want their expressions on their face to be telling when the blue wreath is being given to Lyanna. And Elia is described by George as stiff-backed, trying to pretend that nothing's wrong. Like, she's trying to make a brave face of it, but the overly stiff back is the sign that she's not okay. And why would she be? And there's some people that think Elia was in on this. There is no evidence for that. There is counter evidence for that. So I really don't think so. I think she was just as surprised as everybody else. It might have been in the back of her head that he would taken another wife or have a lover, because he did say to her face, there must be a third head of the dragon. And Elia may have realized that she's not going to be the one to bear that child. I speculated before that maybe they didn't know, or she wasn't capable of having a third child by then, but they might have. They very well might have. And so he's basically saying to his wife, I got to have a third kid, and we both know it's not going to be with you. But that doesn't mean she knows it's Lyanna. That doesn't mean she wants to be embarrassed in front of everybody. So these two things don't necessarily connect directly. You can have both. So they'd be worried as well what if Rhaegar has a child with Lyanna? That would be terrible for this thing. Not only if they get married or run off together. There's so many ways for this to go wrong. And it turns out the child of Rhaegar and Lyanna made Catelyn feel threatened instead of any of these other people. But that's a whole nother story. But we should stick with Catelyn because, again, she's one of our best sources on the Brandon stuff here. Again, he was on his way to marry her when the abduction interrupted the plan. He rode off to confront Rhaegar, again, thinking it was an actual abduction, and he never came back because he was killed by Aerys. So 5 to 6 years of betrothal only to be prevented at the last moment. That is a huge deal. I know we mentioned it already, but let's get a little deeper in it this time. Brandon's not just this trigger-happy, runs off to do quick violence thing all the time. This is a very special situation, a very unusual situation. Yes, Brandon had the wolf blood in him, but it's not like he did things like this all the time. Rhaegar was already very guilty of stuff, like the embarrassment in front of everybody. That was huge. So he's basically saying, hey, I'm going to make you my mistress in front of everybody. That, of course, is extremely off the beaten path. Very rude, very not how this culture works. So it looks like an Aegon the Fourth thing, maybe. I'm taking whatever woman I want. From Brandon's perspective, he doesn't know what kind of man Rhaegar is. It just looks like the Targaryen prince is just having what he wants, doing what he wants, and damn the consequences. He doesn't know, once again, he doesn't know anything about Rhaegar's interest in prophecy, let alone his sincerity in that belief. So he's basically saying, I can take who I want, I can have whatever woman I want. And to add to that notion is Aerys, who definitely had that attitude. So he's like, this is the son of a guy who was a womanizer, who was violent towards women, potentially. I don't know if Brandon knew that about Aerys, but good chance he did. So this is the son of that man. He doesn't necessarily know that Rhaegar isn't like him, but he has in this world, people often assume that sons and daughters are like their parents, which not the worst assumption ever, but it's often going to be wrong, like in this case. But we can see why Brandon might have thought, or at least been concerned, that Rhaegar was like Aerys. But here's another wrinkle. How did Brandon know that his sister was abducted? Because that's what he believes. He believes she was abducted. How did he find out that they ran off together? Well, if Lyanna had guards and companions that she bolted from, that's simple enough. They go and tell what happened. And, pardon? And they find out that way. That's pretty straightforward. That's a really easy one. And they might be a little wary. They may be like, oh, we lost her. Sorry. That's the kind of thing you get punished for. Like, oh, we lost Lyanna. But on the other hand, who's going to catch her? Can you really blame them? That's Lyanna, the amazing horse girl. But still, she can't legally consent to going off with Rhaegar. This isn't like, oh, she chose to go off with Rhaegar? In that case, never mind. Go ahead. Nah, it doesn't work that way in this society. She's 16. Imagine this in our world. Yeah, our world is way different, but in this case, it's pretty similar. If you are driving your car and you see on the side of the road a 16-year-old girl hitchhiking, if you drive that girl across state lines, you have committed a crime, a big crime, whether she wants to go or not, whether your intentions are 100% pure or not. That is a crime in our society, and it's pretty similarly a crime here. It's not necessarily because of her age, but she is a minor. They don't use that term, but it's the same concept. Her Lord Father has all the rights here. She doesn't. Rhaegar has no right to take her away, whether she says she wants it or not. It's her, if anything, it's his responsibility to return her to her family. He can't be party to breaking the betrothal between two great lords. That's not what the crown prince is supposed to do. The crown should not be doing things like that. They should be supporting these, not adding to the problem. right? So Lyanna's wants and wishes here are irrelevant to the crime that Rhaegar has committed in the eyes of her family. There's a theory that Littlefinger is the reason that Brandon found out about the abduction. After all, Brandon had just cut Littlefinger up very badly in the duel, and yeah, obviously he had a good reason to want to stop Brandon from marrying Catelyn because he wanted Catelyn for himself. That's the problem, though. Littlefinger was badly wounded. He was laid up completely. He was in bed. How's he supposed to get a message to Brandon telling him about this? Well, he's Littlefinger, right? He has spies. He has agents. The dude's a teenager at this point. Does he really have that at this point? Does he really have the ability to give Brandon a secret message and divert him like that? Yeah, he might. He might. It's actually possible. Maybe this was like the beginning of his realizing that he could. I'm never going to win with the sword, but I can win this way. That was like his realizing that subtlety is his weapon, not the sword. And he was like, well, that was naive of me to think I could beat a Stark. Romantic foolishness, but I can beat him this way. I can sow lies. I can sow confusion. I can pit two great houses against each other. It's a stretch because of his age and his infirmity, his wound. But we definitely cannot, I don't know if we can completely throw it out, but I think we probably should look on it with a lot of skepticism. Nina doesn't like it at all. She thinks it makes no sense because it just, the message, the logistics are just too difficult. Like Hoster wanted him gone and far away. So how is he going to allow this to happen? How is Littlefinger going to know where Brandon is? Like, he doesn't have a spy network when he's 14. You know, he doesn't have the means for that. He doesn't have money. He doesn't have, how's he paying these people, right? It just doesn't, I don't know. There's a lot of problems here. It's very tempting on the surface just because it's just, it is kind of perfect in regards to the guy who would absolutely want to split Brandon and Catelyn up and the timing of it right after Littlefinger has tried to win her in a duel. But the logistics are very severely against it. And wouldn't Kat know that? Wouldn't she know that Brandon got the news from Riverrun? Maybe not. But again, lots of questions. Why would Brandon believe it if it came from Littlefinger? Maybe he lies about where it came from, but this is just more levels of a very young man with no means pulling off the kind of thing that he probably couldn't pull off at that age. This is the kind of things he's much more able to pull off when he's older and has lots of money and power. But as a teenager, it's a tough sell for me. Now, of the things that Lyanna could have learned while she's away, just after the abduction and maybe before she even gets to the Tower of Joy, because again, the timeline is iffy here. It's possible she learned about what happened to Brandon and her father pretty quickly. We earlier speculated maybe she didn't find out until much later, but we should also consider that she found out pretty quickly, but was still committed. She's like, well, yeah, I still got to go off with you. I mean, maybe this is when it turns dark for her and she's like, okay, I don't want this anymore. But Rhaegar is still determined to make it happen because he's like, yeah, this is awful, but end of the world. Yeah, isn't that worse? So it's really bad for Lyanna either way. It could be really, really bad. It could almost get back to the point where Robert was almost partly right. If Lyanna had changed her mind and didn't want to go with him after discovering just how badly her running off would affect her family. She's like, oh my God, it's my fault that my father and brother are dead. It's my fault this war is happening. It's entirely possible Lyanna felt that way. She was just trying to avoid a bad marriage. I mean, and or believed in the prophecy. Maybe Rhaegar convinced her of that. So that is a bit of a higher-minded option. But she did not foresee the fallout. I really don't think so. Same for Rhaegar. Very similar. If he loves Lyanna, then from his perspective, his actions just led to the deaths of his betrothed father and brother. And civil war on top of that. So they're both horribly hurting over this probably, unless he has no empathy for his beloved at all, which seems unlikely. Again, I'm not subtracting the possibility of love between them being here. I just think it was very complicated and very fraught with other implications and factors. So it's a high price to pay for saving Westeros, all this. The loss of her father, her brother, and causing civil war. But Rhaegar still might be willing to pay that price. Again, it's that versus saving the whole continent, saving all of humanity potentially. So the stakes are awfully high. And this is why I think it's fair to blame Rhaegar more so than Lyanna for all of this by a lot. Lyanna's 14, 15. Yeah, she seemed mature for her age, but still pretty sheltered. Like smart, maybe wise beyond her years, but not worldly, if that makes sense. If she's naive enough to think she can marry the crown prince of Westeros and get away with it, then... but it's Rhaegar's job. He's the crown prince. He's the one to think about. He's supposed to be thinking about the future of the realm, and in a sense, he is. He's thinking about its supernatural future, its health from a much higher level perspective. But still, I don't know why he can't do both. Why can't you be like, well, we can also prevent civil war. We don't have to have a civil war as part of this. Can't we save the world without the civil war? I think that seemed possible, but maybe Rhaegar was a little too focused on just this with the absence of other considerations. He may have been too narrow-minded with his focus on the prophecy. And perhaps even Lyanna was disturbed by that in the long run. Now, the long run isn't very long here. We're only talking, a year. Roughly the length of a pregnancy, with a few extra months added in probably. But, yeah, that's a big deal. So not only did he act knowing that he would insult all these families like he did at the Tower of Joy, or at the Tournament of Harrenhal, and then he followed that up by doubling down. It's like, yeah, I'm embarrassing all you all, I'm insulting you all, and now I'm going to run off with this woman too. So it's not going to stop there. It's going to get worse. And he didn't seem to do much at all to push back against any consequences there. He had to know there'd be some fallout from this. Yeah. Okay, it's fair to say they wouldn't see civil war coming. That doesn't mean that doesn't absolve them. And Rhaegar, again, I agree with Nina that Rhaegar deserves far more blame here. The lion's share, the dragon's share of the blame here, for sure. He's the older guy. He's got the position of higher responsibility, and he's way more worldly than her. He knows these houses and what they might do way better than she would. So he has all the information, all the knowledge, all the education that she doesn't. So yeah, definitely more of it's on him, even with factors that we might discover later that might change a lot of how we see this. It's hard for me to see that differently because we're not going to find out they're actually different ages than they are, right? Like I don't see how that could change anything. So I think they were all very surprised by what happened, but they were committed, perhaps potentially, to seeing it through, regardless of those horrible consequences. But I want to make sure it's clear that Lyanna didn't necessarily stay on track with Rhaegar throughout all that. We have to consider the possibility that she became disillusioned with this whole thing. And of course, the death of her father and brother would be a big reason to start changing her mind. And with Rhaegar's focus being what it was, and his intent and his just sadness and all that, yeah, she may have the initial new relationship energy might have worn off or something like that.
That's good. I like it as a parallel to Sansa, which you're going to get to as well. But if that were true, it would be an additional parallel to her because she also became disillusioned with her prince.
That is very true. Joffrey, yeah, she was super into the idea, and then as soon as she got to know him. Now, of course, we're not saying Rhaegar's like Joffrey. Yeah,
but just the idea that you could be like, oh, this is what I want, and you're like, oh, wait, no, this isn't what I want.
This is not what I wanted at all. Yeah. Now, a little bit more about Jaime here, and Robert. Jaime, of course, is not only sent home at the start of the tournament, he's left in King's Landing when Rhaegar rides for the Trident. So he's there when Rhaegar comes back from the Tower of Joy, gets the army together, and heads out to the Trident to fight Robert, and says, hey, when I come back, we're going to make some changes. Of course, he's referring to maybe removing his father from the throne, but that doesn't happen. Now, Robert may have won anyway, but I think that his misunderstanding of the scenario actually helped him, because Robert felt like the most righteous man ever. He's like, what? He believed that Rhaegar kidnapped and raped Lyanna. He knows for a fact that Rhaegar's father killed his best friend's father and brother and called for his head. His righteous fury is as righteous as can be. Robert is 100% the good guy in his own mind, and he's mostly right in this scenario, right? And there's really nothing like righteous anger to fuel morale. Meanwhile, Rhaegar is like sad prophecy man. He's not like fighting for, he doesn't have that like, he has fire for the prophecy. He has fire for Lyanna, but he doesn't have fire for beating Robert. He didn't hate Robert probably, but Robert hated him. Robert was fueled by his hate for Rhaegar. Rhaegar couldn't match that energy because to him, Robert was just another step along the way to this prophecy goal. Robert was just like a rung on the ladder he didn't take seriously enough. And oops, you should have taken him seriously because that dude just killed you. Yeah, so I think that's really important. When they met on the Trident, I don't know that when we did a Battle of the Trident episode, I'm not sure I mentioned that Robert's motivation would have been so much greater. His righteous anger would have been so much more, would have been fueled by that, and Rhaegar wouldn't have had any of that, probably. Not the anger. He may have had righteousness, but not anger. So, big deal there. All right, let's talk about some Lyanna parallels. We got a lot of these here. Some small, some big. Something that really gets me about this topic is the knowledge that George has already seeded the earlier novels with parallels and hints about Lyanna that we haven't caught yet. We probably, I said that about Ned's chapters earlier, that I bet when we go back, if we ever have the full story of Lyanna, or whatever full story we have, whatever the full story means, there's going to be things we look back on and go, oh, this was a reference. George put this clue here. We didn't know what it meant at the time, but because we've seen him do that so many times, it feels right to guess that there's more of these we just have yet to discover because the connecting points haven't been given to us there. The whole, he gives us the answer before he gives us the question thing. Well, we have the answers. They're staring us right in the face. We just don't know that they're answers yet because he hasn't given us the questions. I think that's a good way to sort of think about this. Nina says as well that there's echoes of Lyanna's story in every single Stark child. Maybe not Rickon, but even Rickon kind of like runs away and hides and kind of escapes for a while. So who knows? And his story's not finished yet either. Some of them are really subtle. Some of them are really on the nose. For example, some of them are like for the readers to notice and the characters have no idea. Like John has no idea how much Val is like Lyanna, that his own mother, nor how much Alice Karstark. We brought up the Alice Karstark situation before. It's all wrapped up in him thinking it was going to be Arya, then it's not, but it is still kind of a distant relative. He has no idea how much the Lyanna vibes are in that moment. The readers, an astute reader is going to catch that, or you all now know that. Next time you reread, you'll be catching that. John had no idea. It went right over his head, of course. He doesn't even know who his mother is, so let alone that Alice Karstark's situation is like that situation. And while Arya is the constant Lyanna parallel, and again, she's ripe for some of these undiscovered parallels that are probably still there. I think if we're looking at Arya and Sansa, I think the things that are in common is for Arya, it's their personalities, some like their disposition, their attitudes, their strength. For Sansa, it's more about circumstances, life circumstances, things that happened to her. Because, Arya technically was betrothed to a Frey, but like she hardly even thinks about that. For Sansa, her betrothal, her life at court, it's like everything. Getting away, it's like the center of her story for the first part, for Game of Thrones, Clash of Kings, all the way until she escapes from court. And even then, she's still kind of in the hands of an enemy, and as Elaine is going to marry someone that is actually kind of a bit like Robert, right? Harry the heir is already known to be a womanizer and has lots of bastards. He's not a good fighter, though, like Robert, so he's just like a worse Robert. So yeah, Sansa, being married to the enemy who slew your father and other members of their family, right? That's also what happened to her. Her family hadn't had a big problem with the Lannisters until after her betrothal to Joffrey. Same as Rhaegar and Lyanna. They get together, then shortly after, Lyanna's father and brother were killed by Aerys. It's like, oh, I just married you, and my in-laws just killed my brother and father. That's great. I tried to escape a marriage to a brute, and instead I got a father-in-law who was an even worse brute. Damn it. Let's also not forget, there's a parallel that George originally had laid out that changed from his original conception, but it still is fun to mention here, which is that George was going to have Robb killed by Joffrey in battle while Sansa was pregnant with Joffrey's child. Hello. Very similar to Rhaegar riding off to war to defeat Robert and Ned while Lyanna is pregnant. So Lyanna's own brother is Rhaegar's enemy, and she's carrying his child. Like, talk about caught between two worlds here. Also, Sansa says to Joffrey, maybe my brother will bring me your head. You know, she has that moment of bravery right before the Battle of the Blackwater. Or I think it's before that, actually. But regardless, that's not long after Ned is killed by Joffrey unexpectedly, which is very similar to Aerys' murder of Brandon and Rickard, which was, no one saw that coming. So it's even possible Lyanna went that far. It's entirely possible, again, that when we're imagining that they were in love, maybe for Lyanna it turned sour. Because not just her new in-laws killed her family, but because she might hate Rhaegar for it. That might turn the whole thing sour. Not just Aerys, but she might just, I hate all this. What have I done? You know? Sansa even tried the inverse of Lyanna's elopement. Lyanna escaped Robert by running off with Rhaegar. Sansa tried to escape not marrying Joffrey by snitching to Cersei so she wouldn't have to go away. So it was like Lyanna escaped. Sansa didn't want to escape, but then she later did. She's like, oops, I should have not tried to not escape. And what happens? It's the same thing. Like Lyanna, Sansa is imprisoned in a tower guarded by Kingsguard, which is what happens to Lyanna at the Tower of Joy. Stuck in a tower guarded by Kingsguard. Thankfully for her, she wasn't pregnant, but obviously Lyanna was. Sansa also did run away from her marriage to Tyrion, as we mentioned earlier. He's also a little bit, some of those vibes are here too. Another heavy drinker and womanizer, which is Tyrion. Now, he wasn't as abusive to her as Harry the Heir is not unlikely to be, but maybe she won't actually end up marrying Harry the Heir. Either way, the parallels to Robert exist. So that makes the Lyanna parallels all the stronger. Now, Sansa also escapes Tyrion by going to the Eyrie, which is probably where Robert and Lyanna met. And likewise, how Sansa ran away from a marriage to Joffrey or Tyrion. Really, Tyrion in this case. She probably ran away from a bad marriage to someone who was worse. Because, who thinks Littlefinger is less bad than Tyrion? Not me. I think Littlefinger's way worse than Tyrion. Tyrion's, he's not so bad. Littlefinger is, for sure. So, yeah, worse. Now, here's a kind of a humorous aside, which is that Tywin wanted Cersei to marry Rhaegar. Cersei wanted to marry Rhaegar too. Lyanna wanted Rhaegar over Robert too. So Robert was just second fiddle to Rhaegar in a number of these situations. But again, he killed him, so, he kind of had the last laugh, even though he didn't think it was funny. And Robert, of course, doesn't even know this. He doesn't know that Cersei wanted to marry Rhaegar. I don't think he ever knew that. He also didn't know that Lyanna ran off. He still thinks she was abducted. So, yeah. Although maybe deep down, subconscious was needling him, saying, but Robert doesn't seem like the kind of man to listen to his subconscious much. Okay, so let's talk about Arya. Arya's a great parallel here, too. Now, we've already had some of the Arya parallels in this episode. We've mentioned them throughout. Her appearance is a big one. She looks like her. We gave the scene with Harwin and escaping on horseback. Now, Arya is in part who she is, though, because she reminds Ned so much of Lyanna. So Ned has all this angst and hard feelings and guilt and sadness over Lyanna, which leads him to treat Arya maybe a little differently because of all that. Like, for example, Lyanna was not allowed to carry a sword around. Rickard wouldn't allow it. He had this whole, I want you to be a proper lady because I'm going to marry you to the South or something like that. That might have been his angle. Either way, she wasn't allowed to carry a sword. Arya wasn't given a sword by Ned, but when she got one, Needle, she was allowed to keep it. Ned considered it and was like, well, I'm going to do the opposite of what my father did because it didn't go so well. So if my father said no sword, I'm going to say sword. Yes, let's do the opposite of that. They also kind of both give up their wolf in the Riverlands, so to speak, right? Lyanna marries into a new family, becomes less of a wolf and becomes married to the dragon and leaves her family, runs away from her family. Kind of gives up on her starkness to in a sense. I mean, she still gets the personality, obviously. And Arya literally gives up Nymeria in the Riverlands, has to part with her in there for that reason. And Arya runs away, right? She runs away also, like Lyanna. She runs away several times, really. She runs away more times than I can count. She runs away near Derry. She runs away in this event with with Nymeria. She runs away from Harrenhal. She runs away from Sandor. She does a lot of running away. But in this case, she runs away from Harrenhal. This includes running away from her Frey betrothal, which Lyanna was running away from her betrothal too. But to be fair, again, as I said before, Arya, this isn't a motivator for her. She's running for other reasons. She doesn't really think about her marriage that much. But she still ran away from it. It's still a thing. It's still technically true. Other non-Stark parallels. Yeah, we talked about Robb's parallels wrapped up with Lyanna earlier. Obviously, Jon. There's many blatant connections there. That could probably do a whole episode of that. And here we go with some non-Stark parallels. Alyce Karstark, we mentioned her briefly, but let's go through the details a little more clearly here. She runs away from a forced marriage to her uncle Cregan, flees alone on horseback through the wilderness, quite possibly what Lyanna did, runs to the son of Rhaegar, though neither she or Jon knows that. That's just a great thing for us readers to go, oh, good one, George. Jon's solution is the same one that Lyanna had. In order to avoid marriage to someone you don't want to marry someone else first. Cut off that marriage option by being married already, which is what happened here. She marries Sigorn Magnar of Fen so that there can be no marriage to Cregan. Very simple. Yep. Remove the marriage option by taking her out of the unmarried category. And technically, the Fen is a little bit Rhaegar-ish. He's the new king of the Thens, or the new Magnar. Magnar, not king, but similar term. Just taken the place of his father, killed in a flaming battle, killed in a big battle at the Wall. Yeah, so there's a little bit of vibes there too. And we know for sure that it was snowing on during Alyce and Sigorn's wedding. And remember, this was overseen by Melisandre of all people. So we have another kind of unusual officiant of the wedding too, as another parallel. Assuming the Isle of Faces were the officiants, the Hearttrees there were the officiants of Rhaegar and Lyanna's wedding. So we also have it's not the Seven, it's not any Valyrian stuff, it's nothing standard. It's either Melisandre or the trees. So Nina suggests that as it was definitely snowing for the wedding of Alyce and Sigorn, winter came on suddenly, as we outlined after the fall spring. So maybe it was snowing at the Isle of Faces when they got married too. That would be a nice little parallel for George to draw. And Alyce's uncle Cregan shows up at the Wall demanding to have her, demanding Jon die or whatever. He shows up just yelling about it, kind of being a dummy, kind of start trying to pick a fight with someone that's way more powerful than him. Brandon shows up with his 6 men and just threatens the entire court. It's kind of what Cregan does. He shows up with his 5 or 6 guys and tries to threaten the entire Night's Watch. Not bright, but a very strong parallel is the point. It's this guy's so angry about having what he believes is his taken away that he's willing to be very stupid about it. Now, of course, let's not forget the parallel to Alyce Karstark that overwhelms all these, which is that Melisandre thought she was Arya when she saw her in her visions, a girl in gray on a dying horse, and that is the number one parallel to Lyanna in terms of looks. Now, Jon thinks of her as looking like Arya too, which means she probably looks like Lyanna. Because if someone looks like Arya who looks like Lyanna, then they probably look like Lyanna too. So Jon sees Alyce Karstark, is reminded of Arya, and we're supposed to, I think of what Lyanna looked like, who would have been a similar age, roughly the same, 15-ish, something like that. Long face, brown hair, quote unquote skinny and cultish. Cultish, a reference to horses. Hello. I mean, George loves this thing. He loves doing it. It's great. I love it. Yeah. That might be even stronger than some of the Arya Lyanna stuff, this Alyce stuff, but because it's more direct. It's an actual marriage. But it just goes to show that George puts it everywhere. The little bits of Lyanna are all over the story. Everywhere. And mostly associated with the Starks, but definitely not entirely. Because here's one that's not. Arianne Martell. Arianne, of course, also worried about being forced into a marriage against her will by her father. There's also a lot of missing information here. Arianne was under the wrong impression about a lot of what her father's intentions were. Perhaps some of that is true from Lyanna's perspective as to what Rhaegar's plans really were. She maybe didn't fully grasp all this prophecy stuff. Now, for Arianne, she's mistaken because her father doesn't actually want her to marry those older men. He was expecting her to reject those marriages, and he was counting on that. But now she's worried about a different thing. She's worried about a marriage, not her own marriage, but her brother marrying Daenerys. She's worried about this King Quentin thing happening, which obviously that's not going to happen because Quentin's quite dead. But she isn't dumb to consider that possibility or to wonder about it. Just being wrong doesn't mean being stupid. But the point is the parallel here. Like Lyanna, Arianne may think she's stuck in sort of a ticking time bomb, sand through the hourglass, rapidly ending situation with this marriage that's going to happen any day now. She doesn't know exactly when, but any day now I could be forced to marry some old man, and that's the only thing she can do is run away and marry someone else first. That might happen. She might marry Rhaegar's son, quote unquote, Fagon, right? If she's the one to marry Fagon, that's going to be such another parallel. And that will also keep her from having to kneel to Quentin and to marry some old man. So that is very Lyanna. And even being stuck in the tower afterwards, like she's the princess in the tower, like Lyanna is in the Tower of Joy. Strong parallel, right? That's really good. Arianne Martell. And beyond A Song of Ice and Fire, again, as I said at the beginning, literature and real-world history, just absolutely full of examples of women fleeing unwanted betrothals. But even the worst real-life examples rarely lead to civil war. But sometimes they do. A lot of times those stories actually do have happy endings. You know, the woman indeed escapes and is in a much better situation. Sometimes it's in a dramatically better situation. It's the one they wanted instead of the one they dreaded. But of course, with so many examples, there's so many possibilities here. Sometimes the real life versions are somewhere in between, right? Generally speaking, as is our wont. Why not give a real life example? Because I love to do that, and this is History of Westeros. Emphasis on the word history as much as there is emphasis on the word Westeros. We like to turn to real history every once in a while. And in this case, we have Honoria, the sister of Roman Emperor Valentinian. He ordered her to marry a specific Roman senator. She didn't want to do that. She was unhappy about it. This was around 450 AD, which means near the end of the Antiquity period. Remember, the Middle Ages began in 500 all the way to 1500. So it's, again, Middle Ages, medieval period, same thing. So this is just before that. Honoria sent her engagement ring, or an engagement ring, and a letter to a man that she preferred over this Roman senator. A man she wanted to marry instead. Or at least that's how he interpreted it. He interpreted it as, if I get her and rescue her from the situation, she will marry me. And then profit. He saw the profit here. He decided he would claim her hand. And for her dowry, he requested nothing too big, just the Western Roman Empire. Who is this man that Honoria sent her engagement ring to, that she preferred over this Roman senator? He's very famous. I guarantee every single one of you has heard of this guy. In fact, I could just say part of his name and you'll know who I mean. I can just say the Hun and you'll be like, Attila? And I'll be like, yes, Attila the Hun is who we're talking about here. Honoria sent this ring to Attila the Hun and said, get me out of this. And the rest is history. He did have a lot of success against the Roman Empire, but he was killed in battle fighting some of this stuff. So it didn't happen, but it makes for a great story, a great parallel, and a thing for us to make our way out of this episode over. I want to hear from you all specifically on this one. I mean, we do a lot of topics here at History of Westeros, so we go all over the place. We do real history, we do comparisons, we do deep dives, we do niche topics. This is more central of a mystery and a topic than a lot of our ones are. So I really value y'all's opinions more on things like this. I want to hear your Lyanna Rhaegar parallels, echoes, things you've seen, whether you have thoughts on it being an abduction or an elopement or any of the details that are lost. There's so many things that make up this mystery that we don't know, that just gives a lot of things for us to each have opinions on and weigh in on and believe or be open to. So we'd love to hear that from you all. Let us know in Discord, Facebook, on Blue Sky, or join us on Patreon. Send us messages, send us emails. Wherever you want to tell us, we'd love to hear it. Yep. Let's talk about our trivia question here. We had Robert naming a beautiful war galley after Lyanna. And the name of it, pretty simple. Lady Lyanna. Just like that. No fancy name, no sneaky thing, just Lady Lyanna. Funny story about this war galley, though. It's part of the royal fleet. You would think that the royal fleet of the Baratheons is toast by now, right? Didn't most of it get destroyed in the Battle of the Blackwater? Yeah, it did. But ironically, though, Lyanna and her tragic end, the ship named after her is a survivor. Because this ship was not at the Battle of the Blackwater. It was one of the 3 ships that Tyrion sent to Dorne to escort Myrcella. Of course, you said Myrcella, the beautiful princess with the beautiful ship, right? So it wasn't there for the Blackwater. So it's fine. It made it back to King's Landing. It's just chilling there. And it wasn't stolen by Orain Waters. Orain Waters explicitly stole the new warships only the 10 new Dromans. So Lady Lyanna is one of the very few ships that's like survived all the books to this point, despite the battles and the burnings and the betrayals. It's still there. So it might even still be around when Daenerys comes to King's Landing, or someone else comes to King's Landing, maybe Arianne, maybe Fagon, who knows? That would be wild. If young Griff was like, hey, that ship was named after my father's second wife. What would he think? What would a young Griff think of Lyanna? That's another character I haven't considered at all, what his opinion might be. So, yeah. Again, this just goes to show the depth of this topic and the tendrils in which it affects the story. So many people, so many impacts, so many characters, so many plot lines. Gotta love it. Great example of George at his best. So I was right at the beginning of the episode. This is the 9th episode of the Topics Moot 2024. The Black Dinner, the influence on the Red Wedding, the inspiration for the Red Wedding, is going to be number 10. The Shadow by Ashai, the inverse of Ashai by the Shadow, is the number 11. And the 3rd episode in the Nymeria series, which we haven't had an installment in, I think, 5 or 6 years, will be the final episode of 2024. So look out for those. And we are so pleased and thankful that you listened to our episode today and will continue listening to us. We mentioned a few other episodes in the progress of going through this one. We mentioned certainly various episodes about prophecy, Many Faced Azor Ahai, recent Melisandre episode. There's some other ones that I'm drawing a blank on, but our catalog is huge.
Where did we mention Benjen in? That's what I was trying to remember. Where did we talk about that Benjen idea?
I don't recall because we don't have a dedicated Benjen episode. Yeah. We do have a Cold Hands episode, but I don't I don't know if it came up there.
Maybe there, but yeah, huh?
I don't recall. Yeah, we've made like 400 episodes in our career, so it's pretty hard to keep track of some of these days. Anyway, that's something else y'all can help us out with. If you know other episodes where we mention Rhaegar and Lyanna stuff or Robert's Rebellion stuff, we certainly have a Battle of the Trident episode and some of these others. So, yeah, that's our recommendations. Thanks very much to Nina for her valuable notes. She put me, like I said, onto some really interesting subtopics here and some really great insights. Her interest in this topic really fueled a lot of the writing here. Thanks as well to Joey Townsend, Jesse Koval, and Bran the Builder, aka Bran Winslow. He made our Fire and Blood / House of the Dragon intro. Joey and Jesse are responsible for our original History of Westeros music. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld for the map you see behind me. You can go to claradox.de to order the files yourself and print the maps out. All of his beautiful maps are available at claradox.de. And we hope to see your pictures of those maps in our social media. If you do order them and post them, we'd love to see them shared around. So do that for us. Do that for Michael. And until next time, Valar Rereadus.